Culture war. Culture war never changes. The word culture war never changes. The minorities fighting for their rights may change, but the old oppressive institutions stay the same. Civil rights? What do they count for in a country where slavery is legal for prisoners and black people are incarcerated en masse for petty reasons? Gay marriage? Fine. But Tucker Carlson is still out for our blood, and we can't go a week without a fascist trying to attack a gay bar. Trans rights? Well, we're changing hearts and minds, but the oppressive power of our old institutions has as heavy a hand as ever. If you get arrested, no matter what the crime, will you get sent to the wrong prison? We know how deadly it is for trans people when that happens, don't we?
We seem to have lost contact.
Culture war. Culture war never changes. We can fiddle around the edges and try to make more room for ourselves, but we're living within structures designed to maintain a hierarchy we've long since decided has no legitimacy. So as long as there are prisoners, can any of us be free? What little thing could you do that could end you up in there, at the whims of the state at its most ruthless? How can we preach our desires for a world where we can be free and equal when there are still human beings in chains? It's been over a decade since the gender wars began. Since Time magazine declared 2014 the transgender tipping point, the brave, selfless warriors of the Gender Critical Brigade have fought tooth and nail to make sure that anyone with either blue hair or pronouns in bio is firmly pushed back over that tipping point and back into the closet whence they came. It's like exercising a demon, in that it's hysterical, morally wrong, and driven by superstition and fear of the unknown, and also because only the far right can do it for long without having an "are we the baddies" moment, and realising that all they're really doing is abusing the vulnerable for a petty sense of self-satisfaction.
Have you noticed that our caps have actually got little pictures of skulls on them?
I don't, sir.
Hands. Are we the baddies?
Despite the hard-fought gains of the Bigot Brigade recently, turning the #1 best-selling children's author of all time to their side, for example, and converting most right-wing parties in the West into full-time anti-transgender fascist agitators, it wasn't enough for them to have all of the billionaire press in the UK at their side. They won a few battles, but it looked for a long time like they might lose the war. For though a Julie Bindel article may have been published once or twice a week, and legal protections in healthcare for trans people may have been basically indefinitely suspended by their actions, trans people still existed. And while they existed, they still dared to use their precious women-only spaces. For years, the gender-critical generalissimos fought hard against the right for trans women to use the women's bathroom, even though they had already been doing that for years with no issue. And the more they talked about it, the more the public could see that they were single-issue, brain-broken weirdos who had no perspective on the world outside their window, which was especially apparent given that the world was both on fire and plunging into a crisis which would leave millions starving and freezing in their homes. But all was not lost. For despite the victories of the gender guerrillas in the long war to strip them of everything they held dear and hang them in the public square, like in the Bigot Brigade's favourite book, The Handmaid's Tale, where Gilead were obviously the good guys. I mean, they killed all trans people, so they must have been the good guys, right? Where was I? Oh yes. Despite the gender-critical corporals being pushed back by private pronouns and her lefty lieutenants, the gender-critical movement still held on to their most valuable and deadly weapon, the power of the current conservative system and its incredibly transphobic institutions. Listen, you can convince many people that public toilets are fine to be attended by whomever, and that conversation will continue forever, because everyone needs to pee. But to convince people that prisons are segregated for a reason, and that trans women belong on the men's part, well, even a lot of well-meaning liberals might pause for thought at that. They've not thought about the consequences of trans prisoners, and what that means for the safety of the trans prisoner and the prison population at large. Still, even if they could be convinced to hit the side of the trans person in a scenario where they could be left incredibly vulnerable and in a dangerous situation by being sent to the wrong prison, it doesn't matter what the public thinks there. It only matters what the people in charge of putting trans people in prison think. And the institutions that are in charge of this scenario, the police, the judiciary, the prison system, those are some of the most conservative institutions in the modern state, and their staff lean extremely conservative to boot. Now, the left may try to convince the more left-leaning transphobe to abolish prisons, but if the gender-critical movement plays their cards right, they might well be able to lean on the most draconian of state institutions to do what they do best: dehumanize, torture, and scar people. I'm Brigitte Empire, a trans woman, columnist for the Daily Telegraph, the most patriotic newspaper in the UK. Don't come for me, The Sun. You're owned by an Australian. Australians aren't British, despite our similar affection for sunburns and racism, that is. Today I'm going to be guiding you, dear viewer, through the treacherous plight of a transgender prisoner, and what the implications of crumbling gender binary might be for the future of our prison systems, and the struggle for trans liberation and prison abolition. This is the Empire Statement. On November 7, 2022, transgender influencer and model Nikita Dragun was arrested in Miami, Florida. Dragun's offence? Causing a disturbance by walking around in her hotel pool unclothed. Is that something people usually go to prison for in America? Well, Dragun is a trans woman, and this story demonstrates the double jeopardy of prejudice trans women can face in certain situations. That being, facing both the punishments for being a woman inherent in misogynistic actions, and being punished for being trans on top. Being arrested for being bare-chested, as Dragun was, is not something that you get in trouble for as a cis man. And the kicker to this story is that after being arrested essentially for being a naked woman in public, Dragun was placed inside a men's prison. Now, this is far from the first time something like this has happened. The police are a very conservative institution, particularly in the American South, where they find their origins in literal slave catcher patrols. You might argue that in this case, this is an insane thing to put someone in jail for, if you don't know how some cops behave. Well, when the police tried to arrest Dragun in her hotel room, she threw water at them, based, which apparently was enough to charge her with felony assault of a police officer. Cool and normal behaviour, totally not biased at all. You know, I'm starting to understand why trans people don't want cops at pride parades. What do you think, Dan? Well, I'm sure they wouldn't want you at the pride parade either. Fine. You do see how this is a ridiculous situation though, right? I'm not crazy. Well, no matter what J.K. Rowling is saying, you can see how distressful this is for her. She's on record being in tears and begging not to go to the men's ward. This is literally a human rights violation, and the police know this. If Lord Nonsbody wants me to pull this story, then maybe he can explain how common this is for people with updated ID and without. In fact, what's the point of being able to update your ID in a way that the state is happy with, which is a long and difficult process, if one power-hungry special little boy has the power to send you to hell on a whim? If one power-hungry special... Parrot. Mochi. It was explicitly against the code of conduct for the Miami-Dade County Corrections Department, and yet it was done anyway, and everyone just let it happen. No, don't call my editors. I'll get you the proof you need that this is dangerous. A 2007 study from the University of California, Irvine, found that trans people in prison were 13 times more likely to get sexually assaulted than incarcerated men. 13 times. And prison rape is already a huge problem for the general population. 59% of trans prisoners in just one California correctional facility, in fact, reported being sexually assaulted, compared to just 4.4% for the general population. Prison just isn't a safe place for trans people. Now, usually once the abuse becomes too bad to ignore and someone ends up doing something about it, the trans prisoner ends up in solitary confinement, and while this gets them out of the risk of assault from other prisoners, solitary confinement is widely agreed to be a form of torture and an absolutely inhumane practice. Honestly, the fact that Chelsea Manning survived years in solitary and being a trans woman in prison is a fucking miracle. Every step in this process, even the ones that people tell themselves are being made out of kindness, are actively harmful and only lead to pain and trauma. And all this for what? For doing the right thing and telling people the fucked up things the government was doing? For getting your tits out in a swimming pool? Have you been to Europe? These cops would lose their minds. You can't walk 3 feet into San Francisco with someone freeing the nipple. And just in case you were thinking that this was just a case of fellow prisoners taking advantage of vulnerable people, often both verbal and physical abuse comes at the hand of correctional officers. A former inmate told CNN about this very thing. They have this whole language they use toward the trans community. They call us horrible names. They used to have us strip out in front of the other inmates to embarrass us. They used to come and ransack our cells and take our makeup. They wouldn't let us eat if we were wearing makeup at all. To quote a review into the treatment of trans people in UK prisons in 2017, following the tragic suicide of Dean Saunders in a British prison, where he was placed when a room in a mental health ward wasn't available. Transgender prisoners are being punished both for their actual crime and for the crime of being trans. Case in point, 21-year-old Vicky Thompson, a trans woman, died by suicide after being sent to a male prison after repeatedly telling prison and court staff that she would be carried out in a box if she went to a male prison. She died alone in her cell. This was entirely preventable. People are dying. And for what? Because they haven't paid enough money and seen enough lawyers to get a piece of fucking paper? Even with her concerns voiced, Thompson was denied use of a razor and hair dye. And let me tell you, if I didn't have the option to control some of the places hair comes out on me, I would be fucking livid. It was also on record that she was misgendered by staff both in person and in writing multiple times. Just in case you thought this story couldn't get any worse, Thompson had previously been sexually assaulted and bullied at this prison, and voiced her fears about this. Every single piece of her story screams at you not to put her in this male prison. She told people that she was scared. She was already a victim of horrible crimes in that exact place for the reasons they're doing this. She was not safe. And putting her in that prison was, as she pointed out, a death sentence. Who does this benefit? Who in society benefits from sending a trans woman into a place she has been raped with the people who raped her, to treat her like a man as she is treated like garbage until she dies? Who benefits from this? Is this what you think about when you think about why we put people in prison? Because this is what prison does. Especially to trans people. But prison is cruel already, and intentionally so. This is not a flaw in a perfect system. This is the system showing its true monstrous colours. In fact, the 2017 report to Parliament that I quoted above cites a number of trans women committing suicide in prison, with one woman in a male prison saying she felt like an animal in a zoo. The mother of Vicky Thompson is quoted as saying, "Our prison system is broken for trans people," and I don't think she's wrong, but in a way, the prison system isn't broken. It's working exactly as it was intended to do. We like to think about prison, well, never really, like out of sight, out of mind. But when we do, we might make the argument that it's for rehabilitation, or that it at least keeps murderers away from the general population. But murderers aren't a massive part of the prison population. And the current prison system doesn't rehabilitate people at all. In fact, it all but guarantees reoffending in many cases. While the prison system certainly treats trans people in a horrific and inhumane way, this is but the prison system at its most nakedly cruel, a mask-off moment, if you will, for a draconian relic of a bygone era. And for all the fuss Rowling and her ilk might make about men potentially lying and saying they're a woman to be placed in women's prisons, you can't even get into a women's prison as a trans woman if you've got double D tits and F in your passport and a pussy fresh from the surgeon's table in many cases. In the UK, you need a gender recognition certificate to avoid going to men's prison, a long and draconian process that only just stopped being prohibitively expensive and involves getting lawyers to sign a bunch of documents and having years worth of paperwork evidence to prove that you're trans, to then send off to be judged by an anonymous panel that decides if you are trans enough to, for example, not to be sent to be at high risk of rape and murder in a men's prison, or even something as simple as getting married as a wife rather than a husband. The latter is cruel and undignified, but the former could easily get you killed, or worse. How's that for you, Dan? When will we know if someone has transitioned enough to... What? Have you been listening? People are in pain, people are... Okay, so how do we know if people are transitioned enough? Fine, I don't know, ask them? You know, some facilities literally look underneath your pants and decide which prison you go into based on whether you have a wang or a wizard sleeve, but lots of people can't afford to pay for surgery, and waiting lists for free surgeries are years long. Should we really be putting someone in the wrong prison because they're too poor to get surgery they actively want? For being on an NHS waiting list that is years longer than the legal limit for NHS surgery can be? What if people don't want it? What if you've been living as a woman happily for a decade? Is that a raise, or because you don't have a pussy? And if so, do you check the crotches of everyone you meet just to check what genitals they have before you feel comfortable seeing them as a man or a woman? Because I can call HR right now, and while I might be on thin ice with them for this video, I don't think they'll take too kindly to you going over people's crotches because you decided that you're the gender police. Take Paris Lees, for example. Paris is an incredible writer, of columns, of books, and is a trans woman from Nottingham, so, you know, I looked up to her so much before I was forced to write this rag at gunpoint by... Okay. Dan, I won't mention the murders. God knows I'm in deep enough shit already. Anyway, Paris Lees, in her memoir, What It Feels Like for a Girl, describes her youth as a closeted trans woman, in which the way she was treated and the way the world reacted to her led to her doing sex work and participating in a petty crime that eventually landed her in prison. Paris didn't come out publicly before going to prison. She was still a trans prisoner in a sense, but she had wanted to go to a women's prison because it felt safer for her then. Would that be wrong? Like, we know how things ended up for her. She's been fully transitioned, whatever that means, for over a decade, so we know in retrospect that she might have done better there. It's irrelevant now, but it does make you wonder, whether we should be consulting people on their way in, or whether prison is fit for purpose, not just for trans people, but in general. If the rigid mechanisms we have in place don't really work, is segregating places by gender weird? Maybe. Is it necessary? Maybe. But only as long as prisons exist to be segregated to begin with. Maybe it isn't the reality of trans people and what their existence entails that breaks the logic of the prison system. Maybe it just reveals that it was broken all along. What if it highlights part of why prisons are just bad, actually? In fact, when someone has finished transitioning is really a strange question, because it's a process that is extremely murky, sometimes has no clear start or finish. And that's okay, because really what we should be doing is stopping thinking of the prison system in terms of punishment and oppression of criminal elements, and take a leap out of Hippocrates' book. First, do no harm. Because if we put people in prison with the idea of punishing them instead of for rehabilitation, all we're doing is ensure they stay in the cycle of going in and out of prison for a long time. Hurt people will hurt people, as a very cheesy saying goes. Scarring people certainly doesn't seem like it's going to make people behave. In fact, it might do the opposite. Do you think if you were put in prison and punished and shamed and assaulted for being an assistant editor for a right-wing newspaper, you'd decide to never edit into the right-wing rag again and repent? No. I know you, Dan. I think you'd become radicalised. I think you'd decide, and maybe rightly, that prisons are fundamentally oppressive and harmful structures. I think that having gone through that system, you would be sorely tempted to burn it to the ground. I think people have a much more snuggly view of what being trans in prison is like than the actual reality. Partially because the outside world has a lot more space for social liberalism than the world for you once you become an enemy of the state and everything that could be used against you is used against you. And partially because I think TV has given us the idea that trans people are just another prisoner in these situations with unique problems, yes, but not uniquely bad maybe. As much as I loved the show overall, I think Orange is the New Black was particularly bad for this. I loved seeing Laverne Cox on screen, when they actually let her have screen time that is. The idea that trans women were being put in women's prisons at the time when the show came out was exceptionally rare. And because Cox's character wasn't our POV character, our point of view character, for the vast majority of the show, we didn't really see her get especially mistreated by either the prisoners or the guards, despite there being literal Nazis in this prison. In later seasons, they showed her in conflict with another prisoner, leading her to be put in solitary for her own safety, which is something that has been reported often and is awful. But on the whole, I think if anything, Orange is the New Black made the American prison system look almost whimsical. An escapist world with all new rules, and I think that does a disservice to the millions who suffer in prison systems all over the world, especially in the US, where Orange is the New Black is set, where prisoners are literally used as slave labour. Seriously, look up Angola Plantation, Louisiana. It's a literal slave plantation with executions, sex slavery, and a whole host of human rights abuses, and it isn't the only one. Prisons are awful places, and I think we've just become numb to their effects and what they mean because we've grown up with them as just a part of the world, the background noise. But why do we permit them to continue to exist? Particularly for petty crimes. Beyond trans people, the prison system is inherently designed to break people for transgressions against the state. Think about how many people are in jail for drug possession. Who are they harming there? Even drug dealers. Does selling something bad for you mean you should be locked up in a cage with abusive guards and higher risk of assault and rape? How exactly? Do you know a drug that's extremely damaging to your health, and yet none of us would think to put someone in prison for possessing it? Alcohol. It's more dangerous than weed.
The Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola is one of America's most unusual prisons because it is, in some ways, a plantation. Once you pass through Angola's front gate, you can't help but feel that you've gone back in time to another South.
It's the largest maximum security prison in the country. Right now, there are 6,300 prisoners. The majority of murderers, you have rapists, you have people who've committed assault, drug felonies.
How long are you here for? Next 40 years? What was the charge? 4 counts? Roughly 75% of the prisoners are here serving life sentences without the possibility of parole.
Louisiana has some of the toughest sentencing laws in the country, and these guys are not going home.
I think when we look at how established systems interact with minorities and newly visible groups, it's a way for us to see these systems for how they are at their core. Their potential for cruelty, for active harm, the stripping of dignity, and their lack of use too. How useless prisons, for example, at least as they are now, are for rehabilitating people, for keeping people safe, for stopping people from offending again. And oh boy, does the last one need a lot of work, because one thing prison does better than anything is making prisoners more likely to be prisoners again once they're back out. In fact, there are tons of great books on prison abolition you absolutely should read. And if Dan's not watching, I'll put some of them on screen for you right now. Because if this story has taught me anything, it's that I want these institutions torn down right away before more people get hurt. There are alternatives, and a lot of people have spent a long time writing about them, whether they're large-scale reforms to complete overhauls of the system, and I can't talk about them here because Dan will be back soon, and I don't want to lose my job. But if you really think about them, prisons are, if you think about it, and here's my hot take for the day, pretty bad. Dan, come on. Okay, if you're watching, Dan's called security. Don't let him take me off the air. Tell your boys to back off, Dan. I mean it. I'll back down. No more woke stuff, or whatever Lord Naltbody is calling it this week. Critical race theory? No, Dan, that's something completely different. Okay, so with an eye on my loyal line manager, Daniel, let me be very clear about the Daily Telegraph's official position on transgender prisoners. Prison? Yes. Pro, prisons are great. Everyone should go to prison. Sorry, I mean everyone who disagrees with the Conservative Party. Is that okay, Dan? Dan? Yeah, that's okay. Okay, good. Transgender people? Well, we all know that being transgender is woke, which is wrong for some reason. So I suppose they should all be in jail, but Dan, which prisoners should the transgenders be in? No, come back. It's a simple question. Security, what do you think? What about you, Jacob? I've seen you looking at transport when you're supposed to be working. You can't possibly think that they should go to the wrong prisons. What about some holiday resort, like a camp, but a camp where they rehabilitate themselves, maybe some sort of labour camp? Or does that sound too left-wing? It does have the word labour in it. Maybe you could, I don't know, concentrate them in that camp? Oh, come on, Dan, we all knew you were thinking it. Anyway, trans people, directly to jail. That's the official stance of the Daily Telegraph. Which jail? Whichever one is less woke at time of recording. And remember, even if you get arrested for getting your tits out, the police will still put you in a man's prison, because all cops are bastards. Worth it. Call off the security, Dan. I'll do better. Next time, it'll be wall-to-wall woke bashing, I promise. Oh, and tell Jacob to send me those links he's been looking at. I want to see if they awaken something in me. Until next time, Poppets, stay out of prison. At least until we work out how to tear his walls down, because we're going to need all the help we can get. Until then, thanks for watching.
Thank you to my patrons. If you want to join them, you can pay £1 or above, and that's a good deal right now because £1 is worth fucking nothing. Thank them, please. Those people are, and I owe them everything. Scarjan, Narania, Joey Cobalt, Naomi Wayne, and Charles TSMTMS. You guys have made my life. And if you want to join them, get your name shouted out at the end, get videos early, you could. Why not? Think about it. Peace.